This is Tom Bowerman, the Director of Policy Interactive. And Tom, you're the author of House Bill 3470, also known as the Climate Stability and Justice Act, which was introduced and progressed in the Oregon State Legislature in the 2015 session. And we understand that a similar bill is going to be introduced in 2016. And we'd like you to tell us a little bit about that bill. And maybe starting by telling us about the evolution of House Bill 3470 and how it was built on the foundation of previous efforts in other jurisdictions.
Well, thanks. So I was the originating author, but one could reasonably note that this is built around other policies, and so much is borrowed from other entities that have been working on similar things. So there are 3 jurisdictions which have adopted similar policy in other areas. 2 of them are Canadian provinces, and 1 is the state of California. And so I'm not taking any individual share of this, mostly borrowing and looking and studying and giving it a kind of a Oregon characteristic, because each jurisdiction has its own unique qualities, and policies need to be designed to recognize those policies. So the reason is why, and of course I would imagine anybody who is watching this interview understands that we have a crisis on our hands, and we absolutely must do something to rein in our greenhouse gas emissions. It is increasingly apparent that we have to do something dramatic, and anything that we could possibly propose is probably going to be less than we should be doing, but we're trying to do all we can within the context of our societal constraints in terms of willingness to go along, the political environment, etc. So first and foremost, it is a very, very urgent task that we do as much as we possibly can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So then we arrive at how do we do that, and I was reviewing legislation going into the 2015 session and asked by one of our policymakers, a legislator, to comment on the legislation, because I do policy research. And I reviewed about 15 bills that were rolling towards the legislature, and I identified significant numbers that were just non-starters. They were probably feel-good statements, but they faced constitutional prohibitions in Oregon because people probably were more interested in getting something they would like to see rather than getting something that would really meet the law. And Oregon has some very peculiar qualities about its constitution, which has to be respected, or else that element of the Constitution must be repealed. So, and then political reality was another context, and so I do in research, I do quite a bit of opinion sampling, and that's a component. We call it opinion research, so it's a component, and we have a pretty good feel for what is likely to be accepted and things that probably won't make it. And so the goal was to have something that's politically viable in the legislature, that's accepted to the general people. A component of acceptability is that it doesn't hammer low-income people disproportionately. This is a sector in our society that has less capability to adjust. They're not mobile. They're constrained by a lot of elements around them in terms of their income and where they live and how they work, and people in middle to upper income have much more flexibility, so we're interested in that component. Constitutional, it has to be constitutional. That's a major part. People talk a lot about carbon taxation, and there's some constitutional prohibitions in terms of how money would be spent, which sure, you can pass a carbon tax, but you have to put the money into roads. And if we need roads, but if we build more roads and we have a real tax and that just creates more roads, it's like the old movie about build it and you will come, and they will come, and we don't need more cars on the highway if we're going to reduce emissions. What we need to do is have low carbon, low emission alternatives. So that's the purpose, is to meet these cultural, social, political, equity relationships, so that and also it was designed specifically to look at solutions which do not harm the economy, that help the economy in studying how it's being practiced in other areas and using the best empirical evidence that we can find. So that's what we're trying to do, and we think that based upon these three other jurisdictions which we're modeling after, their evidence seems very strong that this is a solid policy. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's just simply joining in with other jurisdictions which create bigger movement. That's one of the goals of the bill, is not to have Oregon doing its own little thing, which doesn't count for much, but to lend support to a much bigger movement. And the way we calculated it will be then getting on board with probably the sixth largest economy in the world with these three other organizations. Ontario and Quebec, the Canadian provinces, and California, and then add Oregon to it, sixth largest economy in the world. Bring other tire kickers to the equation, no pun intended, that could move up to the fourth largest economy of the world, and it provides an impetus for the United States as a country to do something similar, or at least it paves the way for getting us on board and getting accustomed to the idea, so when the country inevitably takes this major step for them of addressing it, that we are helping that process occur.
Okay, great. And what about the state's goals that it's set for greenhouse gas emissions? How does that fit in with the bill? How does the bill address those?
Well, in the year 2007, the Oregon legislature did pass legislation which set targets on reducing our emissions, specifically that by the year 2020 they would be 10% below what they were in 1990, and by the year 2050 they would be 75% below what they were in 1990. So they passed that, and that's a law, that's an ORS, but it's what we call aspirational. It had no implementation ability built into it. It had no requirements. It said, we will do this, but there was nothing complementary to be able to effectuate that particular change. And so the bill that this now takes it from a kind of an aspirational objective, and it says provides a responsibility to the administration through an agency. A specific agency is named, and it says you have this responsibility and you must make it happen. So it assigns responsibility to an agency that has been given legislative responsibility to make rules to effectuate and meeting that particular goal. And that's what it does first and foremost. That's probably the most overarching thing. And what it's doing is it's taking the 2007 aspirational goals that were adopted and then gives the responsibility to the Department of Environmental Quality to make it so, or as Captain Kirk of this, make it happen. And so that's the order. And then it also has, the bill is 9 pages long. Always encourage people to read it. Right now, that would be on the Oregon webpage called HB 3470, and the most current version is HB 3470B engrossed, which is 6 amendments that came in the 2015 legislative session. And in a short while, we believe, based upon the conversations we've been having with legislators, is that it will be re-entered, and there will be some additional work done on it. We have a variety of suggestions in terms of tuning it up. It will be substantially the same as I understand it, but there will be some adjustments, and it will get a new title when it hits the the next legislative session. What was the question again?
You addressed my question very well. It was about the goals, and I was going to ask you also about how the bill accomplishes those goals or helps us reduce our emissions, and you addressed that by speaking about the DEQ's mandate. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about how, actually maybe we could dive into how the cap works and how DEQ is likely to implement this policy and what the bill specifies they must do.
Yeah. So I didn't mention the cap. What it does is and so the cap becomes that very element that the legislature passed, and so they defined the limits, but they didn't really make it a cap, did they? They said this, we're going to reduce. So now it says that we're going to put a cap on our contemporary emissions as of this year. And then by the year 2020, we'll be meeting this goal that was set in 2007. And by the year 2050, we'll be achieving that goal that was similarly established. That's the 75% goal. Additionally, it recognizes that it really should not be a rigid, finite goal, because we're constantly learning additional information. The climate change issue and the threat that we face is evolving, and like, for example, the IPCC, which is this big scientific panel of over 3,000 qualified scientists, they issue a report every 5 years. Every time they issue a report, a lot of additional information comes into the equation, new information about threats, opportunities, and there's other sources of scientific information. The bill stipulates that every 5 years we will update this, and we will change the trajectory that we have set for ourselves according to best science. And so what it is essentially recognizing that this has to be a dynamic process, and it's conceivable, really we can't rule it out, that maybe the goals that we've set are too steep, and that science says, oh, not to worry. There was a letter to the editor a couple of days ago, and the person was saying, it's going to be better. We're going to be better off for the warming that's going to happen. Okay, well, if the best science says that that's true, then we can take it. We don't have to achieve that trajectory to reduce that we had set for ourselves. Or conversely, other people are saying we need to move faster. James Hansen, the expert that moved away from NASA because he felt that he could get more done outside, but he was a NASA scientist. And he says that we should be targeting 85%, not 75%. And he has built a very credible argument around that. And that's the agency's responsibility to assimilate that information, and every 5 years take that into account. And the legislature has every 2 years a check-in on that. And so that's the fundamental component of it, is a cap, and then the decline would be presumably a straight line between 2020 and there is also, we have fallen off of that aspirational goal. One of the reasons we need legislation to make it finite and legally required is that we are not on target to meet that limit. And so this is why we need to do it, and because we're off track, we may not meet that. And that also says in the bill that if we get off and we still have that goal, that means they have to steepen it up and get back on track. We're not going, it says it's not permissible, these are paraphrasing, but it's not permissible just to fall off and then go, yeah, no, we're not making it. It says that if you're not making it, then you need to redouble your efforts, and you need to steepen that curve, that slope, to get back on that line and stay on that line, knowing that you never really get, they're very specific targets, and you're never going to be on a target. It's like saying you're going to take a trip to Portland and you're going to arrive there on a particular minute, but you calculate it, and if you get into a traffic jam, then you have to speed up a little bit. If you get into, maybe another poor metaphor or simile, but in any event, you adjust your travel path according to the circumstances as you find along the way. What else?
So there's a cap, and the cap is reduced each year, or at intervals. Is it annually?
Yeah, it's every 5 years as targets. So you set targets for every 5 years, and so then you have those targets to meet, and you keep moving along that pathway.
Okay. And how does the cap work? For example, what type of emissions will be capped, and about how many emitters will that include?
Well, ultimately, this will be under the jurisdiction of the agency. So we are only basically giving the agency first the responsibility and then the permissibility. So it makes the agency responsible for delivering, getting, and meeting the goals. But it permits the agency to undertake certain regulatory pathways. So then it's their discretion in terms of what pathway they want to take, but based upon the evidence and the way that we've written the bill, so it doesn't require them to take a specific pathway, but it allows them to, and now we enter what we project they will do. So don't take it the wrong way that this bill says that they must do this. What it says is that we project, based upon the evidence that is out there and the way the bill is written, that this pathway will occur. And if we follow the examples of others that already have this in their jurisdictional authority and power and have adopted this particular approach, only relatively few entities will be under the program. And for example, in California, they built their rule around approximately 75 companies in California. So they have 36 million people in that state, and they only have 75 entities so these are typically corporations or companies that fall into the category of the regulation. And those are defined by people who emit, or companies that emit more than 25,000 tons of carbon emissions per year, so it's quite a large amount. However, that represents 85% of California's emissions. Oregon is 1/10 the size, and it has 1/10 of the GDP, and just because of the comparability that we're both American states and we're both affluent and we have a lot of the same general characteristics, there are some differences, but largely for simplicity purposes we just simply will take 1/10 for saying that. So under that circumstance, we are trying to be very conservative here, so rather than saying 7.5 companies, we really tried to be very generous with how many would be under the and we also know that not only is Oregon a smaller state, but the companies are smaller. So companies being smaller, they have a very big refinery in Richmond, California, for example. And because of that, that sort of takes makes it disproportionate. So we just kind of rounded it generously up and said, probably estimating 50 companies in Oregon would fall under it. So it's not you and me and every mom and pop store. They don't have extra work to do. They don't have forms to fill out. They don't have to do anything. And it's targeting, and we again will estimate that with covering 50 companies, and again we probably do the same thing, put it at a level of about 25,000 tons. And that would be probably 50 companies or less, and that would be the ones in the scheme. And we again, based upon records that are kept already by the Department of Environmental Quality, we estimate that that will be 80 to 90% of Oregon's emissions. We do want, though, to have the program capture that kind of large. We want to kind of make it manageable. We don't want to have a lot of bureaucracy. We want to capture as much as we can with the least administrative burden. But let's be honest, this will impact us, everybody, because all these businesses are the ones that are selling goods, and we're buying fuel through them, and we're buying their electricity and their coal energy and things like that. And so however that affects them, and the costs that are ascribed to them will be felt by the customers down the pathway. So we should not say that it's free to you and I, but we have reached the stage where we're confident that knowing the Oregon public, that they are willing to pay the external costs that come from our lifestyle choices that emit greenhouse gas emissions. So we're very confident about that.
Okay. And are those 50 companies energy producers?
Some of them are energy producers, and some of them are just energy transferers. They may be companies that just simply transport fuel from out of the state into the state, so they're essentially middlemen. But you capture that emission potential as early in the process as you can. So when it's not exactly right when it crosses the state line. So if you have a pipeline bringing fuel into the state, but when it arrives at their facility and they meter it, and there's already techniques in place to keep track of this. They're posted up on a Department of Environmental Quality webpage. It's updated every year. It's not a additional burden to keep track of this, but yes, I think I'm answering your question.
Okay.
Yes.
Energy sector, and then.
Yes, energy sectors, but also products. There are companies like some of the very big wood products, and these products are being sold all over the world, all over the United States, but they reside here. Some of those may fall into the equation. This will be discretionary on the part of the agency how they implement that.
Okay. And right now, are you just referring to that first tier, the first couple of years? There are
Yes,
there
well,
are other
I'm saying,
tiers, right?
yes, when our neighbor state, California, did this, they brought it into 3 tiers, and they've been in the first stage of tier 2. So the first tier was only the electric companies, and that was for a year and a half. And the next tier, where we are now, is capturing all of the transportation fuels that are going into it, and some of the manufacturing components are in that. So the first tier, I think, was about 30%. The second tier got them up to 85%. And then by 2021 is this last 15%. It's really what we call the high-hanging fruit. It's the little stuff around the edges, you know. They're working on that. They'll have to bring that into the equation under their formula.
Okay.
Same way with us. This will be, but we also figure that there's what's called de minimis, or why go after the stuff that's so tiny that you can spend more administrative costs in getting it. And our goal is to be 75% below where we are, and if you can capture 85% of the emissions with your program, you should be able to get there. But this is a work in progress. We will be doing the updates every 5 years. There will have to be adjustments. We will learn more. We will get better at what we do. It's a incremental, gradual process, and I would imagine that stepping tier rate. But on the other hand, the work that Ontario and Quebec and California have already done have set the stage, and a lot of the work that we would have had to do if we were starting from scratch is already done, and I don't expect us to have to do the same level of work as if we were initiating this at the outset.
Okay. And there's a market mechanism in place in California which involves cap and allocation, and
Yeah.
we might join into that system. And can you tell us how that would work?
Well, it is probably one of the most attractive parts of the program because it has a way of funding renewables and conservation and public transportation systems in ways that we have never been able to do very effectively previously. But the way it works is that you have these 75 companies, and they're in the program, and they have to pay for their emissions. They are called allocations, and for every ton that they emit, there's a fee. And the fee started in California, for example. The fee had a floor when it was started at $10, and it increases 5% every year plus inflation. And right now it's, and that's just called the floor. It then goes to the open market, and if there was a shortage of those and they were needed to be acquired, they would gain in value because entities might be able to develop, produce those in surplus. Take, for example, a company that has some abilities to reduce their emissions, and so they're in the program, and they implement some actions and they reduce their emissions, and that would give them a surplus of emissions. They can sell those on the open market. And if they sell them on the open market, that keeps the allocation price sort of towards the bottom. And if there was a shortage, the allocation price would rise because people have to go out and buy those allocations, and they would become sort of, it's a supply and demand relationship. In the 3.5 years that California's been doing this, the cost of allocation for a ton of carbon right now is about $12.50. And for those allocations that are being sold in California, that is yielding in California, this year is going to be a little bit above $2.5 billion. And so California has this revenue flowing from the pricing of the permissions to emit, and that is going down. And so in 2015, they're going to have that, they do have that money, and they're plowing that right back into the economy, and they're putting it into renewable energy projects. They're putting it into conservation, they're putting it into public transportation, and they have research entities that are looking at ways that we can creatively bring new technologies online, make better decisions, move towards a fossil-free economy. And they are really aggressive down there, trying to set the stage. California is the 7th largest economy in the world, and it's a huge economy, and what this is doing is it's sending a market signal across virtually everywhere, and they're the driver of a lot of innovation and a lot of creative ways of thinking about doing this. But what's happening in California is that there are a lot of companies that have foregone conservation measures, and now that they're in the program, they're undertaking those, and those conservation measures then are yielding them the credits that then they can market out on the open economy, and it keeps the price of the program low for themselves. And it's quite. I think that California had fully expected the market to drive that price up, but instead it's actually staying pretty low. But they're on their path. They're 2% below their emissions level of where they were in 1990.
Okay.
Oregon is 7% above its goal for where it is supposed to be in 1990.
Great for California.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything more about how the auction works or the allowance auctions that you think people might be interested in hearing about?
I guess a lot of people want to know if it's going to be a bureaucratic nightmare or if it's going to be really expensive. Is it going to? And California has 15 people in their program to run this, and if you do the arithmetic, I think that comes out to less than 0.25% of the entire revenue from the program that's going to administration. They actually have 15 more people in the program that's dealing with exclusively with carbon credits, which is a different subcomponent of the program, and they allow carbon offsets in the program. Sometimes people think that's pretty controversial, but it has its place. Still not a heavy bureaucratic demand on the program, but overall, for the size of their program, and we project in Oregon by way of proportionality that this program in Oregon will take about 3 full-time equivalencies in terms of staff position to run this program.
Okay.
That was actually done within the agency and analyzing it. It isn't our guess, it's the agencies looking over the bill and evaluating what it would take them to run the program based upon conversations they had with other jurisdictions which were already doing it.
Okay. I have a question for you that goes backwards a little bit to the cap and how it works and the fees that the companies are paying. So, and this is the question's a little bit confusing, but at first the emitter is notified of the cap, and then what happens over time? What happens if they go over their limit? Do they only pay a fine or fee if they go over their limit, and that's reduced every year?
Yes, if they cannot make let's say they increase the size of their business, they double the size of their business, and if they are not able to creatively address that through altering their manufacturing technologies or their business practices, they would have to go out and buy the right to do those emissions in the open market.
Okay.
And so right now in California, that would be that. By way of comparison, if their fuel use were to go up just for equivalency purposes, because it's the way we tend to think about it, how much would that increase a gallon of gasoline if I were running delivery trucks? That would increase their price by 12.5 cents, about 12.5 cents a gallon. So if price right now is 2.5 cents $2.50, that would increase their fuel cost by 5%. So it apparently is not what I'd consider to be a deal killer for growth. But on the other hand, California is demonstrating that there are businesses that are growing, but what they're doing is they're going out and buying renewable energy to address their needs rather than fossil fuel energy. Because when you get a pricing mechanism like this, it acts as a strong incentive to figure out how to get ahead of the curve so that you don't get behind the curve. Because you get behind the curve and then this floor price starts to go, you have the floor price won't go up, but the open market mechanism, if there's a real demand for these, then instead of $12.50, the market can float up. Maybe it costs $25, maybe it costs $50 a ton of carbon. So if that's the case, what they're trying to do is they're trying to avoid those costs. So they're going out and securing sources of energy in the open market. And what's amazing right now is that the way that this is working is that there's a lot of new renewable energy coming online in California. So this thing kind of works. It's like what I call the carrot and the stick. You have the stick out there and say, this might happen, And so they go out, and the carrot's out there to basically go after, and they're getting the carrots being more effective than the stick right now.
And the carrot's the renewable energy option.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. How much do we think the state would earn, and what does it do? What does the state do with that auction income?
Well, we hope and we expect that, based upon the way the bill is written, and you have to kind of like get into the very substance of the language within the bill. But first of all, to your first question, what revenue would be yielded? And again, we fall back to a very simplistic way of just doing 1/10 of California, but we think that's still reasonably accurate. If we were where California is today with their program, we would be seeing this at about $250 million a year, which isn't a vast sum of money by the state's budgetary standards, but it still could be used very creatively in things like public transportation. It's really hard to fund public transportation. Most of our public transportation support systems outside of Farebox come from very tough. We have employee taxes in our area here. Other places use property taxes, other parts of Oregon. But to do expansion is very hard to do. It's we get federal grants, but those are really tapped out. They're really hard to get. They're very competitive. In California, they are working on a high-speed rail between San Francisco and Los Angeles. They're using about 1/10 of their revenue flow from their bill to fund the development at, I believe it's about $200 million a year is going into that high-speed rail transit. That they wouldn't have had any other way to find funding, or if they did, it would be bond revenues and things like this. But it's actually acting as essentially fee-based against the external costs of carbon emissions, and turning around and plowing that into low carbon future investments, low emission future investments.
Okay.
So in Oregon, $250 million, imagine that, what we could do in Oregon with that. And from a economic and jobs perspective, that's jobs, that's growth, that's transitioning us so that we can actually have a halfway decent future that isn't so totally dependent on fossil fuels.
And what do you think we're likely to do with that money in Oregon?
Well, what would we be likely to do? I would say that there's ample conservation opportunities, but we see a lot of renewable opportunity, and especially the east side. These are entities that traditionally, these are areas, sectors of our economy and sectors of our society that have been importing their energy. It could be biofuels from wheat waste that get baled up, and they do have creative uses for that, but it also could be turned into biofuels. There's other bio waste products that can be coming out of eastern Oregon and other rural areas, but mostly sun and wind. And that's all of those are kind of up there for more development, more investment in renewables, and especially the bill did not specifically target, but there's some amendments that are working into the upcoming bill, which is to put more focus on rurally depressed rural communities that are rich in natural resources like wind and sun, and channel investments into those economically distressed parts of our state.
Okay, so we're talking about a program which creates revenue, which the state can invest in renewables and other projects. There are other options which people have been talking about in Oregon, including a carbon tax, or we talked a little bit about you talked about why that's not feasible for us in terms of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. There's also an option of, some people have been talking about taking money and giving it back to residents. Can you talk about what's the difference between a carbon tax and cap and trade program, and also why you're recommending and why you're advocating for a policy that would allow us to invest rather than return to Oregonians?
Well, let's see. I think really you have two fundamental questions, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so In about the year 1979, Oregon was given 2 ballot initiatives, and they both addressed and ballot initiatives to amend the Oregon's Constitution. And one of them said that the kind of the big one, the tough nut, was that when you collect any fees or taxes on fossil fuels that are used for transportation, that those have to be put into highways. And so if we were to do any particular creative carbon taxation on externalities of carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, those would by constitutional requirement be going back to building highways.
Yep.
Yeah, it can't be used for bicycle lanes, unless it's just incidental. If it's like sort of a small, you can kind of squeeze a bicycle lane, but to really do set aside for bicycle lanes, or you do any number, you can't do it for public transportation. It's prohibited. You can't fund the state police with it. There's a lot of things you can't do. You basically are maintaining and building highways and bridges. And that isn't to say that there aren't some needs for that, but there are some really substantial needs for public transportation and other ways of addressing how we do business and how we get around, how we live, and attaching an external pricing mechanism to greenhouse gas emissions really is limited by the Constitution. There's another.
So what about public opinion of a carbon tax?
Well, so I did mention that we do in our research we do opinion sampling, and we do it by the book. It's not push polling. It's really trying to get high quality information in terms of how people really feel. And we found back when we did work with a Portland outfit called DHM, a long-standing opinion research firm, that we worked on what's called the Oregon Values and Beliefs Study, and that's a story in and of itself. But in that survey of 190 questions, we asked a couple of questions about climate change, and we found in that generally the public is highly supportive of addressing climate change generally, that we need to deal with this. And we broke it down by sectors of the state, and Eastern Oregon and was over 60% supportive of dealing with climate change. We can break it down by political party. We find that even Republicans are supportive of dealing with climate change if they're in Eastern Oregon. In other words, it doesn't make any difference what region of the state you're in, or by what sector, or by what income category, or et cetera. Citizens of Oregon are supportive of dealing with climate change. More recently, in May of this year, we specifically went and polled 3470 to look at results with that, and this is the 3470 bill that we've been discussing, and we found 64% support in favor of it, and 22% opposed to it, and the remainder undecided. So about a 3-to-1 margin in favor of it, some very strongly. It has, mostly it's that difference between opposition and support, because we find when people are undecided, generally speaking, when they learn more about the bill, they'll kind of split proportionally out, but even if you take it 50-50 and you divided it up there, you can see that the support is strong. And by way of comparison, when you do opinion surveying, you're really getting attitude responses. But in California, the agency that was given responsibility, like what we're proposing in Oregon, is that when the agency was given responsibility, they passed this whole set of rules, and the California Chamber of Commerce decided that they would take it through initiative petition to repeal it, and so they did that in 2010, and Californians voted on that by a 64% plurality in favor of it. So it was like a 24% margin between support and opposition. They rejected the repeal of the law down there to rescind it, and so that's a very strong element of proof that the general public, at least in California, and that's pretty darn close to what we are in Oregon with the way that we poll. So we don't think that we got an aberrant. We're going to do that again in just a couple of weeks. We're going to poll this again, look at the new elements that we're putting in there, but also we're interested in whether this incredible summer with record heat and incredible wildfires and the drought, the persistent drought that we're in. I mean, we've had, since April, we have a rain gauge on our place. We've had 2 rainfalls since April, and under a quarter of an inch in both of those rainfalls. And our property, I live on a farm, and it's just bone dry. The ground's hard. All of the vegetation is suffering. It looks parched. And so we're wondering how other people feel about that, whether it's going to change the numbers in terms of support, whether this is more of a front of the mind issue for them. But back to, so did I answer your question?
Well, you explored you really gave us a good idea about the public opinion for a policy like House Bill 3470. What about public opinion of a carbon tax?
Oh yeah, well we started doing that general surveys a while back, and I think we did one in 2012 and then one in 2014. And each time we did it, we found that when you ask the question, would you support a carbon tax at, first of all, you find 75% in favor. I've already told you about that. And that is consistent. So, but that's general policy. Then you go to the specifics of the policy. What do you think about a 25 cent a gallon tax on gasoline at the pump? That's 10% support. So in other words, you go from 75% support for policy to 10% for public policy to address climate change. Okay. 75%. You go to how about a 25 cent a gallon tax at the pump, and it falls to 10%.
Okay.
Okay, so you can see that all of a sudden you've gone from, oh yeah, I think we should do something. Well, are you willing to pay 25 cents a gallon more to address this? No, I'm not. Okay, big disconnect. It's the 10% support for the 25 cent a gallon and 37% support for the 10 cents. So even at 10%, you don't get up to 50% support. And we generally figure that you need to be over 60% because you don't want to be right at this isn't a vote at the ballot box. If you take something to the ballot box as an initiative, all you need is a plurality. But if you're really working with the legislature and asking them to take something and take a stand on something, it needs to be over 60%.
Okay.
But so we went into detail on the 3470, as I said, and we were at 64%. We asked them a lot of the detail questions, and every one of the detail questions in terms of how it works, that's it. They said that increases my support. That there wasn't any issue that in some of the people that took the questions that there wasn't anything that they didn't like about the specifics. There were some things that they liked a lot more than others, but nothing was below 2 or 3% increase in terms of the level of support.
And right now you're speaking about pieces of a policy that are similar to 3470.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and so going back to the carbon tax. We specifically found repeatedly, and I'm aware of several other polls, same thing, is that a carbon tax, when it gets translated into a price at the pump, is not popular. It does not achieve a 50% level of support.
Okay.
So that for us was an example of a non-starter, is that we want to have a policy that the general public supports.
Okay.
You also asked about there's another approach, rather entirely different approach, and that's sort of tax and dividend. And there was an organization that is in Oregon that's been working on a tax and dividend, and they came to we talked with them about the limitations on the constitutionality of the tax, and they subsequently adopted our cap approach, so that they converted their bill into a cap and dividend. So rather than tax and dividend, now it became a cap. So they're using the front end methodology, but then when the revenue begins to flow from this, they're proposing to actually return it to the people. So in our latest poll, we asked the general public what they thought if a policy is enacted which yields a revenue flow, would you prefer to see it being spent for reinvestment in items like conservation, renewables, public transportation, and research, or would you rather see it refunded to the taxpayers and their dependents? Because that's the way this other approach is framed, is that we propose that it just be a refund when you take it out of this energy flow, this carbon emission charge that we're going to do. Then what are you going to do with the money? We're just going to refund it to the taxpayers. And we found, now we've done this twice, and each time, same result, that it's over a 3-to-1 margin that people would prefer to do it as a reinvestment, that is, take the money and put it into the conservation and renewables approach, rather than a refund. And there was some element of what's the word I want? Counterintuitive, right? Who doesn't want money back, right? Do we trust government to do anything? You know, it's like there's this kind of a, why would we do, you know, they're never going to do the right thing, you know, and so we did some qualitative interviewing where we'd go and ask people why, because we just sit with them, and it's asking them other questions, and we work slowly into it, kind of like what you're doing with me, and we get to that question of, well, why would you, why do you want to put it back in? Why don't you just want it as a refund? And they said, because we need these types of investments. We really need these investments. And so it's really an example of people aren't completely convinced that there isn't a role for government to do things. And of course, it's going to be the responsibility of this agency to do a good job with it. You know, and that's where we're, you know, this isn't an ending project. You don't just give the responsibility to the agency and then the problem goes away. I mean, they have to be watchdogged and et cetera. But it was interesting to me that at the substantial margin of the reinvestment approach, and that's why we have taken and constructed this particular proposal in this particular manner.
Okay, that's a really good segue to a conversation about the fact that a lot of people are concerned about cap and trade programs in general, and probably because of mistakes that have been made in Europe. And how do we make sure this policy is effective and it won't end up benefiting large corporations? And how do we watchdog the agency, as you suggested that we should?
Well, I don't care if it benefits large corporations personally. What I'm very interested in is getting the carbon emissions pointed downwards. And if I don't care who it is that benefits, but you know, of course we'd like to, and we intend that the revenue gets redistributed broadly and to working class individuals. I will also say that, as I said right in the beginning, the intent of the bill is to be a work in progress. It needs to be, we will have to face course corrections. We will make discoveries. Nothing is error-free, but we are learning the lessons of other people. When California designed its bill, which I've referred to previously, they looked at Europe and they said, the first thing we do not want to replicate what Europe did. They gave away a lot of allowances. They underpriced their allowances. They said we do not want that to happen. And now into the mid stage of year 3 of their program, it looks like they kind of found a sweet spot to where it's not increasing the price of commodities or fuel. And at the same time, it's working, and they're on track. It's contributing to lowering their emissions. So, hats off to them for kind of finding that. You know, they might have tried to price it higher. We have critics that are saying, "Oh, emissions, they should be priced much higher." You know, and I really don't disagree with that. They should be priced much higher. I think it would be a stronger incentive, but you have to have a public that's willing to go with that. In Sweden. And in Denmark, they price their emissions over $150 a ton, and California is pricing their emissions at $12.50 a ton, whereas the European Union has been pricing their emissions at about $2 a ton. So you see, and And all of this is kind of a longer story, but Europe at $2 a ton, they're experiencing that they're not making they haven't. Hats off to them for trying something, but they didn't get their signals done right. Sweden and Denmark are very aggressive on addressing their greenhouse gas emissions, but the market analysis of economists say that if you have a pricing mechanism by itself, then you really do need to be at or over $100 a ton. That represents at least $1 a gallon of gas, but there's a lot of pliability, we call it elasticity, in the price of fuels, and it really has to be the total price of fuel. And so fuel prices have really come down. They've come down from 4. When they were at 4, we were saying that the price of fuel would have to go to 5 or 6 to really make a behavior change. There's nothing to indicate that at $2.50 a gallon, which is where it is right now, that it wouldn't have to be $2.50 a gallon to make behavior change. In other words, the pricing mechanism as a signal in and of itself has to be remarkably high, and we think it's higher than the general public is willing to accept. On the other hand, with the cap and trade and the way that the allocation systems work, what it's doing is that it's approaching it from a completely different angle. It's sending these price signals, which are carrot rather than price, and so people are basically getting on board. And one of the reasons they get on board with taking aggressive actions to become going towards renewables, doing conservations internally within their businesses, within these 75 businesses, is that they're trying to get ahead of the curve because there's an anticipation that this price is going to go up. So that the quicker that they get down, because every year it's going down 3%, so they know that the next year they don't want to have to be paying into this, so that they're doing everything they can to change their behavioral patterns, going to different vehicles, changing delivery patterns, using different manufacturing techniques, bringing in conservation measures, changing out incandescent lights to very high efficiency light, changing their entire patterns of behavior. Now it's still very, very early in the program, but what it's showing is that without any heavy-handed pricing or regulatory approach, other than just the cap and the reduction, and the way this system works, carrot and stick, is that they're making their mark the way that they intended, and that's what's very interesting about the process so far.
Okay.
Well, I think what you're really asking about is in terms of the oversights, and let's discuss a little bit more how the system probably works for Oregon, because we're tracking 3 other jurisdictions and following the way that they're enacting it. Oregon is already a member of what's called the Western Climate Initiative, and this is a group of 11 jurisdictions. I think that there's 3 Canadian provinces and 9, that would be 11, so then there has to be 8 states in our country. California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming. I'm not sure I'm getting them right, but I know that of our 3 western states, it's 8 states in the country. I think Utah's in there. So 11 jurisdictions form the WCI, and this is group of states that have said, yes, we're interested in figuring out how to solve this problem, and Oregon is a member of this. And California's kind of a strong lead, but Washington's definitely in there. British Columbia's really strong member. The WCI then created what's called the WCI Incorporated, and this is what's called the open market mechanism. This is a system where the opportunity where I talk about allocations can be bought and sold across the boundary lines. So if you're a member of WCI, all of a sudden you can buy your allocations in California, you can buy them in Quebec and Ontario, and if Oregon becomes a member, then it's a larger market. You have a lot more flexibility to be able to reach out, and there's different opportunities. It's like trying to imagine Oregon finding opportunities or places to sell their product, and they could only do it within the state of Oregon instead of being able to export into Canada or into California. So, And the real objective here is to have the whole WCI involved in this. So Oregon would become number 4, and then we move incrementally along to number 11. By the time we get to number 11, that's the 4th largest economy in the world, if we were able to do that. And others, I think there's another 18 that are observers to WCI. Observers are kind of the next tier down. They're not full-fledged members, but when there are major decision meetings, they are there as attendees observing. You know, you hear about that happens in the United Nations. Some countries are observers, and that's 18. There's even there's states in Mexico, for example, that are observers. This could really go big, and so it could also be a way to get the United States to act, just by doing it state by state. And so what we're really trying to do is find the pathway. There are a couple of leaders here. Oregon's action could be really important. California would really like evidence of one more state in this country, so that would be a leadership role for Oregon to take, to basically affirm, endorse through behavior, through action. So California sees Oregon as really important right now to get on board and join this. I think I left out a part. What am I not talking about that you asked the question about? Oversight. Mm-hmm. Foremost and paramount is this is not the legislature to make a decision and then forget about it. The primary oversight is always going to be the legislature. The legislature, when they pass a law, can go back and change that law if they have to. This isn't a done deal, you know. And the bill even stipulates that between 3 months before and 6 months before, somewhere in that window, a period before the main long session in the legislature, there's a report from the agency to a legislative interim session that reports how it's doing. And so that there's a discussion with the Legislative Oversight Committee to look in on this, because the legislature is really interested in seeing this happen, and they also don't want to have it go sideways. They don't want it to end up being inconsequential or not accomplishing its objectives or doing the wrong thing. And so fundamentally, that's a very important level of oversight. There are other components of oversight that come into it as well, and it's just it's getting more detailed and more detailed as you kind of talk about it. But inevitably, I think also, you know, you have to have oversight from the citizens. This is a profoundly important decision, and I'm not going to stand here and say this is a perfect law. I think it's the best we can bring to the table, but it's going to be a work in progress for a long time to come. I say it's a work in progress for my grandchildren, who are 5 and 7, and this is not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon. We have a lot of work to do for a long time to come, sorry to say. And if we had taken action in 1964 or 65 or in 1990, it would have been easier, and it would have been much more doable. But the evidence is on the table that acting soon and acting aggressively will not be a hard lift as long as we do it right.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tom, for taking this time to talk with us and for all of your hard work on this policy. Thank you.
Well, you're sure welcome.